Welcome to China Manufacturing Decoded from Sofeast, the podcast where we take you through some of the major topics facing importers and manufacturers in China today.
Hello, it's Adrian from Sofeast here, and in today's episode, which is episode 50 of the podcast, I am joined by a special guest, UK-based ISO 9001 and 14001 consultant, Phil Brown, who runs his own consultancy here in the UK. Phil's joining me to talk all about the ISO 9001 QMS, its benefits, different types of implementations, and to give us some tips on that. So, hello, Phil.
Hi there.
Hi. Can you give us a quick self-introduction, please?
I've basically been in business for 18 years, providing services to companies to meet the requirements of ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, 9001 being the quality management standard and 14001 being the environmental management standard. I basically work with companies to get them certified to those two standards.
Okay, thanks for introducing yourself, Phil. So can you talk me through what the ISO 9001 QMS is and the various benefits of each section of that?
So the benefits of ISO 9001. It's a standard designed to ensure that companies actually deliver to their customers what the customer requires. And there are a number of elements within the standard which are important. The first one that I tend to focus on is the area of leadership. Now, leadership is basically a commitment on the part of the senior management to observe the requirements of the standard and commit the whole of the company to meeting those requirements. So the way we look at the company's commitment to the standard is, first of all, I will look at the way inquiries, quotations and orders are placed on the company, how they record those inquiries, how they deal with quotes from those inquiries, and how they link orders when they're received into the company back to the original inquiry. One of the key areas of the standard is that companies use what are called approved suppliers. Now, an approved supplier is one that's been assessed by the business that the supplier will meet the requirements. And once the assessment's been carried out, and it can be done in a number of different ways, one of the easiest ways of approving a supplier is if they themselves are already accredited to the standard. So what the company needs to have a record of how they've approved that supplier, how he's been included on the approved suppliers list. And it's key that those suppliers are the only suppliers that the business uses to purchase items that are required in the manufacturing process. Another key area of the standard is the area of non-conformances, be they internal non-conformances or external with customers, how those non-conformances are recorded, how they're investigated, and how the root cause of the problem is identified. And having identified that root cause, it is a key requirement of the standard that actions are taken to actually put that right, and that the customer is actually informed of the solution to the problem. Or if it's an internal non-conformance, that the operating team within the company are aware of the root cause of the problem and are able then to correct it.
You've mentioned non-conformances. Could you give me an example, please?
An internal non-conformance is where a problem has occurred in production, where the ongoing problems are identified later down the production process. And for instance, if it's a reject, why was the product rejected? Was it rejected because of something that happened in the process? Or was it rejected because it didn't actually follow the correct process through the whole of the procedure? So an external non-conformance is obviously where a customer has complained because something didn't work as it should have done, or it's failed in service, or it's not been correctly packaged when it arrived, so it's damaged in transit. So those are the sort of customer complaints that customers tend to find a problem with. So, having talked about customer complaints, one of the areas it's important that the company has detailed records of the competence of the employees to do the jobs they're required to do, their knowledge of the processes, and their skills in operating those processes. One of the areas that I work with companies to make this much easier for them is what's called a skills matrix, where they identify the employees, and against each employee, they will actually assess the ability of that employee to carry out the various tasks. And sometimes it can be a traffic light system where red means that the employee is incapable of doing the operation, amber where they're undergoing training, and then green when they've gone through the training process and are approved to carry out that particular action. And also in case sometimes being a trainer is identified as blue, so that it's very easy to see the relative abilities of the operators within the company. And this is particularly important where with flexibility of labour or absenteeism, anything like that, where when a person who's not normally doing the job is assigned the job, they're actually qualified to do it. The company has to set itself targets for improvement, and these targets have to be meaningful, measurable, and achievable. So examples of targets that companies have to set, things like delivery on time. Customers expect when a delivery is promised that it will actually arrive on time. And also another area where a lot of companies are benefit from having the standard in place is to look at ways and means of reducing rejects or scrap.
Yeah.
Scrap rejects is not only the cost of the scrap, but it's also having to remake it. The company, these targets the company sets itself don't have to be achievable. What they do have to do is measure how they're doing against the targets and regularly review these. And this is an area where communications comes in. It's important these targets are communicated to the people actually doing the production so that they know that they are working to these specific targets, and that once having been communicated, regular reviews are carried out against these targets so that the operators know how they're performing. Delivery on time is an area in question. Clients can find that because they're using various methods of transporting the goods to their customers, that some avenues of transportation are not working as well as others. And this can clearly be pulled out when delivery on time statistics are looked at. Regular review of the business systems. The standards actually calls upon companies not only to maintain the systems they've got in place, but actually to look at continuously improving it, getting it better, making more use of the systems. An important area of the standard is what's called management review, where companies review how they're doing against the various requirements of the standard. And these have to be done at least once a year, but hopefully with a lot of companies, they'll do them more regularly than that. And the company has to look at the targets they've set themselves, not only for business improvement, but for things like productivity, how they can benefit from new means or new methods of production. Production planning and scheduling. When orders are received, there has to be a plan in place to how to manufacture these goods. What is going to be the loading on the factory? That's got to be clear. It's got to be identified to the workforce. And certainly, if a company has got a situation where the person who shouts longest and hardest is the one who gets goods made, then it creates a situation of chaos within the production area. So production planning is a vital part of the business. Control of design and development. This is an area where if a company designs its products or develops new products, these have to be done in an organized way. Records have to be kept of what the designs are or the developments are. And not only the records be kept, but they've got to be sort of peer reviewed to make sure that these records are actually properly documented and actually meet the requirements of specific customers or specific product ranges. Documented information. All companies tend to record some information, but this is required to be readily accessible, meaningful, measurable, and analyzing. The standard talks about analysis of information. It's important that clients analyze the information that they are documenting, not only analyze it, but actually agree actions where action is required, monitor how the action is carried out, and the effect of that action, so that they are aware of changes that are made in the process, that those changes actually result in what they're looking for. Most of the companies that need this standard have not really analysed all their documented information. Very often they'll keep masses and masses of records, but actually very little of the information that's been recorded is then used to improve the process, improve productivity, improve product generation. The standard calls for identification and traceability. And what is meant by identification and traceability is that when the finished product is ready for dispatch, it carries identification marks which then clearly trace it back through the whole process, very often where it's on what machine it's been made, the operator that's made the product, the parts or ingredients that have gone into the manufacture of that product, where those parts were sourced from, what the batch details were. So in the event that there are problems at the end customer, the actual other sisters or brothers of what's been made can be traced as well. So if necessary, a product recall can be made. If a failure of a particular part happens in service, what other products have been made using that part. And this is very interesting when it comes to automatic production lines, because very often, if you're not careful, the parts picked for a particular area are not always recorded. Control and measuring equipment. Many manufacturing operations use measuring equipment to actually monitor the product that's being made. Maybe dimensions, things like thickness, wall thickness if it's a tube, or if it's a particularly shaped product that the product is within the tolerances described on the order. And not only do they use the measuring equipment, but it is regularly calibrated, so it's checked against national standards to make sure that what they're actually using is actually measuring what it should be measuring. And these calibrations have to be recorded, how they're recorded in a calibration log. As I've already talked about, analysis of data and actions resulted from measuring that. This can apply not only to product, but also to incoming raw materials, incoming parts, any other checks that are done during process. The final part of the standard talks about continual improvement. And what's meant by continual improvement is that the business is always striving to improve the offer made to a customer, but not only product, but also processes, speed up the process, streamline the process, and also the systems, the quality management systems. Quality management systems are live. They're not actually something that a company puts in, leaves it on the shelf, and that's it. And that's where I want to talk about the drawbacks for companies that use having achieved ISO 9001. That's it. They use it very much as a badge rather than as a means for improving the business. Examples of that would be where the managing director pats himself on the back when he's achieved ISO 9001, thinks that's it, and then doesn't commit to leadership with regard to operating the management systems. He can find on occasions that it'll all fall flat on his face, because every year the external auditing body comes in to do a reassessment of the company, and there are certain things that have to have been completed before that visit. The company has to have carried out internal audits of all its management systems to check that they are being operated correctly. It has to have carried out a management review, and it has to have demonstrated that it's got customers at heart. In other words, that it continues to look at non-conformances, continues to look at how it's achieving its objectives, and generally there is a commitment there to continue to improve. ISO 9001 is not intended as a one-off pack. It's intended for the business to grow forward, to continuously improve, and to actually be a live company that will grow in stature and in customer confidence.
That's a really good explanation of the ISO 9001 standard. And yeah, you're totally right. How do you manage quality once when you're manufacturing continually? It's got to be an evolving process. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Indeed, when you talked about management buy-in, actually, we've recently written about this. Our CEO, Renaud, wrote that, if you're managing a manufacturing organization and you think that bringing in a quality manager to handle ISO 9001 implementation is just enough and no one else really needs to have a big stake in that, I guess you would fundamentally disagree with that approach as well.
Yeah, oh, very much so. It's got to be bought into by the whole of the workforce, and not only bought into, but regular communication with them as to how things are going. There are so many companies that tend to think that senior management are the only ones who really want to run the business. The people in the factory are just as interested on how they're doing against the targets that have been set, how the business is doing, how new customers have been brought on board. So it is a live business. It's not a static situation, ISO 9001.
Right, yeah, absolutely. And I guess that, that could actually help with things like staff retention as well.
Yes, yeah, I think that is probably a vital part. If you communicate with your workforce and the workforce gives feedback, then the workforce is far happier than if they're kept in a vacuum and completely kept out of the circle when it comes to how the business is running.
Yeah, I think that might be quite interesting in China because, annually you do see a lot of operators in China who after, when it gets to Chinese New Year, they perhaps move on and find a bit better paying job. It could be in a completely different area of the country. And I suppose that if they're put in an environment where they've got, where they kind of feel like there's more stake in what they're doing and they understand the impact that they're having and that they're able to have a voice in terms of improvement, perhaps it might help to hang on to those guys when the year rolls round.
Yeah, senior management have a vital role to play in this. They must actually encourage the operators and really demonstrate to the people working in the factory that they are a vital cog in the whole operation of the quality management system. They're not just a means to an end.
Yeah. Okay, great. The next point that I wanted to talk about was the difference between the types of implementation that you can have. So there is such a thing as a good and a bad ISO 9001 implementation. So could you give me a bit of information about that, please?
Well, I think a good implementation is where whoever is helping the company put the system in, if it is an external person like my good self, that person becomes almost part of the company and not only gets involved in the ISO systems itself, but helps to encourage operators to actually do what the system requires, being part of the family. The worst case scenario I come across where there's a software package that's introduced to the company and the company just buys into that software package. They've got a series of instructions to what they've got to do to meet the requirements of each section, but they haven't really got a personal involvement in it. There are various software packages around which, yes, a company can get ISO certified, but it's not what I call a real live operation. And it very often falls flat on its face because when the external auditing body comes along to do the audits, they find various non-conformances. So to my mind, a bad installation is where there isn't human involvement in helping the systems meet the requirements of the standard.
And you've mentioned, having some experience in both good and bad implementations. I mean, do you have any real examples? I'm sure you don't need to give identifying information of companies that you've worked with, of course, for confidentiality. But I mean, maybe you can explain about some of the implementations that you've been a part of, and give a flavour of, what was the situation before and then after, once the QMS was actually in place.
Well, I can give examples of where I've been called in where a company had already so-called ISO 9001 put in by a non-national approved body. They called me in because they'd got this piece of paper which said they were ISO 9001 approved, but a lot of their customers turned around and said, well, that isn't actually to the requirements, where it's got to be approved by a body that's been sort of certified by a national accreditation body to put the standards in.
Okay.
I went into that company and there were something like 7 or 8 manuals which had collected dust, which were never used. And I actually then went through each part of the standard with them, putting in the requirements of the standard, working with the people on the ground in the factory, so that they understood why they did things, what they were for, and what the benefits were. And that client actually then wrote me a fantastic testimonial for doing it, which has got me quite a lot of extra business as a result. What I like to do is where I had a company that is a supplier to a national car manufacturing operation who asked me to put ISO 9001, ISO 14001 in for them because they needed it as a tier 1 supplier.
Yeah.
And I worked with that company. I worked with them for probably about 8 or 9 months, getting all the systems in place, not just for 9001, but 14001. I did their internal audits, followed by their management review, helped them through the management review. And when they came to be externally audited, they actually passed with flying colours and didn't have any non-conformances. That is a client I actually took on in 2004, and he's still a client of mine. He's still a tier 1 supplier to the local car manufacturing company, and he's eternally grateful for helping him maintain his business. And the big benefit he's got of having these certifications is that where he's in competition with companies quoting for the business who haven't got the certification, he wins the contract. So it's important from that point of view.
Yeah, well, I can imagine, especially when you're in the auto, supply chain, that you've got to really be hot on all of that, because otherwise those big auto makers, they're not going to touch you, are they?
Another example is a company that approached me that produces communication systems for severely disabled people through our local health service. He'd been a supplier to the local health service for, I think, the last 10 years, but was told at very short notice, unless he got ISO 9001 in place, he would not have his contract renewed. So I went in there very rapidly, got his management systems in place, did the audits for him, followed through with the management review, got him certified within the 3-month period to the local health service of systems for severely disabled people. And he thanked me very much for doing that.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. So before we close out the episode, if there's a company involved in manufacturing who have yet to put in place their QMS, do you have any tips that you can share that the listener can take away?
I think one of the biggest tips I would share with companies is ensure you communicate every bit of information regarding how the company is doing to the people that actually manufacture the product. It's amazing how, if you do that, how much more involved in the company they become. And another tip is, I would say, take notice of customer complaints. Customer complaints are very often a source of valuable information. Not only does a customer welcome you dealing with his complaint in a thorough professional way, but then he will then recommend you to other potential customers as a reliable supplier. So that's a couple of tips I would give.
Great. Okay. Well, Phil, thank you very much for sparing the time to join us on the podcast today. I've really appreciated you sort of popping in, as it were.
Yeah, I've enjoyed being on it. Thank you.
Great. And do you have a website if anybody wants to learn more about your consultancy?
Yeah, my website is www.philbrownconsultancy.co.uk.
Great. There's the plug. So if anybody wants to go check out Phil's website, please have a look at that. Phil, it's a beautiful day here in the UK, lovely and sunny. So let's go and get outside and enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for joining me, Phil.
Right.
Thanks for joining us. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget to like and share, and you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all other places that you get your podcasts from. See you next time.